Hey everyone, welcome back. A lot of you have been asking for a NeoVim setup video, so here's how I use NeoVim for full stack web development in 2024. I personally don't like cursor animations, fancy dashboards and so on, so I try to make my setup feel fast and somewhat minimal. The most important things for me are good language server integrations, intuitive file navigation, and fast refactoring. So that's what we'll be focusing on. You can see the entire setup in action right now as I'm working on a side project. You can find the GitHub repository for the setup in the video description below, and I've also prepared a free ebook that goes over all plugins used in detail, and I've also included a list of additional plugins that you might find useful in your workflow. The link to that ebook can also be found in the description down below. Firstly, we're going to clone the LazyVim starter so we have something to work with. I'm using LazyVim because I like its built-in lazy plugin manager and I feel like it has a great starter configuration that only needs a couple of tweaks. We'll be enabling some extra plugins right out of the box that are mostly a must-have. ESLint for linting, Prettier for formatting, TypeScript, JSON and Tailwind language server support, GitHub Copilot to make boring tasks quicker, and Mini-hipatterns for inline color highlighting, all of which we'll go over in more detail later. Next, let's set some default Vim options. I map my leader to the spacebar, set the default encoding for file types to UTF-8, enable line numbers on the left part of the screen, make Vim use the current buffer name for the window title, and enable automatic and smart indentation. I make sure search results are highlighted in the current buffer, disable backups since I don't need them, show the last command in the status line, which I don't use but you might, and then I disable the command line and the status line. I just don't find myself using it often, so I prefer the extra screen real estate. I convert my tabs to spaces for consistency, make it so that at least 10 lines are visible above and below the cursor when scrolling. I enable command previews, for example, so you can see the effects of a replace command before applying it, and I make the search results case insensitive. Once again, make sure the tab key outputs spaces instead of a tab when possible. Add indentation if word break is enabled when your text does not fit on the screen. Make each indentation 2 spaces deep, and make the tab output 2 spaces by default. I disable line wrap, but we define the wrap indentation amount before if we ever need it. It's also useful to allow backspacing over indentations, line breaks, and the start of the insert, so you don't have to move around empty white space. We add the asterisk wildcard to the path so that we can perform search in subdirectories. We ignore the node modules folder and make sure to open up split windows on the right and below the current buffer by default, as well as keeping the cursor in the same position when closing a window. Lastly, we disable mouse support because who needs a mouse, right? And we also add a formatting option that prepends asterisks in block comments, and that's it. Next up, let's define some useful keybinds. Firstly, when cutting out a single character, I personally don't want it stored in the clipboard, so we map it to the underline register, which I never use, so it's like a black hole. We'll add some slight tweaks for number refactoring, and now the most used keybinds, saving and closing, these obviously I cannot live without. Let's make working with tabs easier as well. And we also need to make window management a little bit more intuitive. And since no code is error-free, I need something to quickly check all of my errors and diagnostics. You can also take advantage of the keystroke visualizer at the bottom of the video if you're ever wondering which buttons I'm pressing at a given moment. Let's set up the color scheme. I personally like Sonokai, even though I probably butchered that, so you guys can let me know how I should pronounce that. And now arguably the most important part of the setup, the LSP and autocompletion. Firstly, we need Mason.nvim. It's a package manager for language server protocols, debug adapter protocols, linters, and formatters, but I used both coc.nvim and then the Nvim LSP installer for native LSP support, but coc has been superseded by Mason and it's amazing. Now we obviously need to configure which LSPs we'll be using, which is why we have the nvim LSP config. We'll configure both TypeScript and Tailwind to use the location of the .git folder as the actual project root. And we'll also enable Inlay Hints, which provide cool additional information about your code in line, like the expected type of your function arguments and so on. However, at the time of recording, the latest stable version of NeoVim is 0.9.5, and Inlay Hints have been added in version 0.10 and above, so you might need to install the nightly build of NeoVim. And of course, we cannot forget nvim-cmp, which gives us this beautiful autocomplete dropdown. And we need the emoji library as well if you want fancy icons. Let's quickly verify that it works by typing out some code. If you install the proper LSP for your file type, you should have autocomplete suggestions show up. We may now have the LSP installed, but we also want proper syntax highlighting, indentation, and maybe folding, so we need Treesitter. We'll just ensure that our most important languages are installed by default, and if we open up any code file now, we should have proper syntax highlighting. Let's add two cool plugins now. Firstly, we'll set up Mini-hipatterns, which we mentioned before, that just shows color values directly in our terminal. For example, the hex color for white actually shows up as white, and the reddish color actually shows up as red. Now maybe the plugin that I use most, Telescope. Telescope allows us to quickly find files, search for strings in our entire project, preview files, and much more. So we'll bind the most important functionalities to some keys, and we'll also take advantage of the Telescope file browser and map it to the SF keybind. Additionally, that file browser needs some further configuration. So we'll bind the capital N key to creating a new file, the H key to navigate into the parent directory so we have a Vim style navigation, and we'll also bind the Ctrl U and D keys to scroll large amounts of files at once. Pressing S and F now opens up this neat and quick little file browser which we can navigate with Vim Keybinds, and we can search and open files quickly. Now on to some fun stuff. Let's make some UI tweaks. I personally find the dashboard extremely annoying, so I disabled the baked-in dashboard plugin, as well as Lualign, which sets the status line. This should finally remove our status line completely, since Lualign sets the Vim last status option to 3 when initialized, and we explicitly defined it as 0 before. Next up, Noice.nvim. This replaces the messages, pop-up menu, and command line. I want to say thank you to DevSLife, who I borrowed the code for Noice.nvim from, as he disabled the annoying no information available message when you try and open up the definition of a variable which hasn't been documented. Now we'll configure some design options for nvim-notify, which shows those notifications in the top right corner. We also use Bufferline for fancy tabs that look like a proper GUI, so we'll modify it a bit to make it less cluttered. A cool plugin that we also have is Incline.nvim, which shows the file name for all open windows in the top right, so we'll just modify some of the theme colors. Now a must-have plugin for work, LazyGit. For this to work, you need to have LazyGit installed on your system, so if you're on Mac OS, a simple brew install LazyGit will do that for you using Homebrew. You may have noticed by now, but I use the semicolon as sort of a second leader, as I have a lot of keybinds going through the semicolon key, so pressing semicolon plus C will now open up the LazyGit interface. So now we have Git version control support, and previously we configured Telescope to have a file browser, which works great, but when working on new projects, I like to always have a visual overview of the folder structure and where I'm at currently. So for this reason, we'll also be adding in nvim tree. This is mostly the default configuration, but the settings that matter most to me are the open in a new tab keybind and closing the tree when I open up a file. And we definitely want to ignore node modules so we can index the tree faster. We also want to automatically open the tree if we didn't specify which file to open when opening up NeoVim. Let's also quickly add some keybinds to toggle the tree and to find the current file in the tree. A very cool file and folder tree is now displayed. We can toggle it and we can open files in new tabs. And finally, a very cool integration suggested by a viewer. Let's add Dadbod, which will allow us to execute database queries directly from NeoVim. I've also added a keybind that closes the nvim tree and opens up Dadbod in a new tab, as I don't want it to mess with my current window layout. If we press space plus D, the Dadbod UI should now pop up in a new tab, and we should be able to perform queries and mutations on our databases. Just a heads up that I've already added my database, but you can also do so by calling the dbui add connection command and passing in the connection string for your database. Next up, let's add some plugins for better refactoring. Number one is Incremental Rename, which just allows us to rename a variable in place and update all of its occurrences. I bind this to leader rn, which in my head stands for rename. And now renaming has been made quite simple. And number two is refactoring.nvim, which allows us to inline or extract things like variables or functions. So if we have a value that can be extracted into a variable or vice versa, we should now be able to do so by just highlighting it and pressing space plus R. For integrations, I only have one plugin at the moment and it's phenomenal. It's called rest.nvim. Rest.nvim allows us to make HTTP requests straight from NeoVim. It has great support for all types of requests, as well as variables and environment-specific configurations. We're mostly using the default config here, but we're mapping backspace R to the REST command that executes the query. If we now create a .http file, write a basic request and hit backspace R, our request should go through and we'll be able to see our result. Last but not least, I also do a lot of testing in my day-to-day work, so I needed something to run tests easily, and that's where NeoTest comes in. It's a general testing plugin that allows you to add different adapters based on which tests you're running. In my case, it's mostly jest tests, so that's what we're focusing on. Make sure to include the proper dependencies when initializing NeoTest, as the adapters are installed separately. Also, since I'm working with monorepos most of the time, we also need additional configurations so that NeoTest jest can find the proper jest config file and the actual root of the package we're testing. If you're not working with monorepos, you can skip this part. The rest of the configuration is just the default configuration except the keybinds, which are once again focused on the semicolon. And now we should be able to open up a test file and run it directly inside NeoVim. And there you have it. This is how I set up my NeoVim for effective full-stack web development in 2024. I think everyone watching wants to have an effective NeoVim setup, so if you have suggestions for improvement, make sure to share it in the comments. If you found this useful, make sure to subscribe for more web development content. Once again, if you want a more detailed breakdown of the setup and additional plugin recommendations, check out the free ebook I've prepared for you guys in the description below. Oh, and by the way, I've recently moved back to my home country, Croatia, so I might start recording some videos out in the nature or maybe coding by the sea. So let me know what you guys think about that. Anyway, thank you all for watching, have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next video.